So we were really blessed to have John speak to us just before lunch, and he certainly made me think, and judging from conversations I've had with other people, you certainly provoked some thinking, which is great.
Good.
For people who weren't here this morning, do you just want to maybe go a bit more into your academic background and just a bit, just to set the scene?
Academic background. First, I don't know that academics validate spiritual awareness, but they do help sometimes in explaining things. So I do have a doctorate from Friends International Christian University. I've spent over a decade with different rabbis. Probably the three most influential, two of which really are not around anymore, and but their books are. One is Rabbi Ira Kaplan. Another one is Rabbi David Cooper, and then still alive today is Rabbi Michael Laitman from the B'nai Baruch Institute in Israel. So, and then of course there's my other life where I'm the chairman of the Wagner Society of Southern California, the composer Richard Wagner. And before I came here, I was there in Bayreuth, Germany for 2.5 weeks, doing the classical music thing. And in my other life, when I'm not doing classical music, then it's Zeppelin, Kiss, Aerosmith, and all the other guys. So that's a nutshell, unless there's more.
No, that's great. Thank you. So what's going to happen now is John and I are just going to have a discussion, really, about his new book, The God Who Didn't Want to Be God. There's sometimes when you read something and it just speaks truth and life and really makes you consider the universe. I remember a few years ago reading Brian Zann's Sinners in the Hand of a Loving God, which really opened my mind to so much. And I had a similar experience just reading through this book. And some people may have read some of it. I'm assuming most people haven't read it. And we just want to share a bit about what's in it. And as I said this morning, you don't necessarily have to agree with everything that John and I are saying this afternoon. But what I just ask is, before dismissing something out of hand, say, why do I not agree with this? And if the answer is just because I've always thought something different, but you can't really explain why you've always thought that, then maybe have a bit of a deeper open mind and be prepared to think about things, because challenging what we believe and challenging our thoughts is always really useful and important. So on that note, let's start with a big one.
Okay.
The book basically says, the whole premise of the book is that there is no God.
Right.
Which is a big statement. So is this you embracing Dawkins, converting to atheism?
No.
Or is there something else going on?
No, despite the fact that I think years ago, Dawkins was challenging Christendom, not so much from the science point of view, but some of the key points that I think, sadly, some of us in the church were afraid to raise. But that said, the premise of the whole book, The God Who Never Wanted to Be God, comes from the standpoint of two angles. First of all, when you start looking back through literature and history, the being we called God never referred to himself that way. That came later as people began to create these things called gods. And this being was among those gods and eventually was labeled the name God. That's one side. The other side is Jesus shows up on the scene and undoes the notion, because by the time we get to the scribes and Pharisees, their notion of God has even degenerated from what Moses was calling God. And it was a total degeneration into a being. And one of the things I talk about in the book is what makes a God a God. 9 times out of 10, whether you're watching a movie, you're reading a book, 9 times out of 10, a God is who can destroy everything. Hence Godzilla. Okay, why? What is it about our belief that if you can create and destroy, you have the right to make all the rules, and if you don't keep the rules, you get destroyed again? If you don't keep the rules properly, something has to die to correct that. All of these things were totally in a paganistic world, adapted by the time Moses reaches Mount Sinai. We go from Abraham, which was called a grant covenant, and it gets changed into what's called a suzerain covenant, which is at the request of the people, because they wanted a God just like they wanted a king. One who would rule and be in control and judge, and eventually it grows into damnation and all these things. And that definition of a God is truly what we created. So thus, the God who never wanted to be God, he allows himself to be called this because that's what we grasp and understand, because there's way more to this creator than just a God who creates and destroys and judges and condemns and all those things.
Brilliant, thanks. I guess the natural question that flows from that, though, isn't the word God contained in the Bible all over the place? For God so loved the world, etc. And Jesus uses those words. So how do you cover that?
Well, I usually, and actually I think it's the first and second chapter, I go over that pretty quickly. By that time, whatever was perceived out there was a God. And when Jesus shows up on the scene and begins to talk, he's talking to people that believe in this thing called a God. Jesus doesn't refer to him when he's speaking to this being as God. He calls him Father. A complete shift. Because at that point, he's identifying himself to an eternal source that gave life and that he emanates. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. We're that one. And in Jesus saying that, though, he's not saying it from a standpoint of I'm special and you're not. Actually, he's saying you're just like me. Jesus, the saying, Jesus is not an example for us. He's an example of us. Mm-hmm. So when Jesus, which to us, because we're so familiar with these terms, they're part of our culture. Oh, Father God, we call him Papa. We do all these different terms, and that's fine if that helps us along the road a little bit. But when Jesus showed up in the scene and called God Father, they were ready to pick up stones and kill him. God forbid that we be connected to an eternal source that makes everything live, who's full of love, compassion, and kindness. Let's kill that, because that's what our God would do. Our God is a judging God that kills and destroys, right? So the whole notion of God as it's used in the New Testament, and for that matter the Old, but the Old is another story. In the New Testament, the word theos is the word that's there. And theos is the Greek term for God, as in Zeus. That's used. Old Testament is a little different. Elohim, that term, if you ever do any reading of the Jewish mystics, the Jewish rabbis, like Kaplan and these other people I was telling you, they will not use G-O-D. At best, for the sake of the Western world, they'll do G-D.
You or me?
I think it's me. A little better. They'll use G-D. They actually refuse to call whatever that creator is God. Sure. Now you get to crinkle it for a while. So, well, we can just share mics, I guess. There you go. So Elohim, for example, by true definition, is really the word powers. El is strength, Elohim, plural, the powers. That's it. Very ambiguous. Because in Jewish theology, you can't talk about that which you can't perceive. You're not allowed to. If you can't perceive and understand it, don't talk about it. So we know that there's something great that exists out there. El Elyon, for example, God Most High, usually translated, or the force that's most high, as referred to that Abraham uses and Melchizedek uses that term. Very, very specific, but it's always been there. It's now we just are looking through the lens of close to 2,000 years of theology that's developed and changed. So really, and one of the things the book points out is that the notion of calling God, this creator, the Father, God, is actually the first step of humbling and humility, in a state of humility for us. You know, we think of the incarnation, all right? Jesus, God in the flesh, right? The incarnation. And then we see this incarnate Christ getting on his knees and washing the feet of his disciples. That's total humility, total servanthood. In the same way, when God allowed himself to be called God, if you want to use that term, when this creator, the Father, allowed himself to be called God, that was a step of humility for our sake, but not who he is.
Thank you. Yeah, I've heard you refer to God as being a narcissist. Obviously, you're not referring to the
Father,
creator,
the creator,
God,
right?
but
Jesus,
the God,
the Christ, right?
the God represented by that. Yeah. So moving on, you spend a lot of the Bible talking about a lot of your book talking about what our true self and our false selves. And those phrases keep on coming up. And you talked a bit about that this morning as well.
Yes.
But do you just want to elaborate on that and what the difference is?
How do you elaborate on that without preaching for another 20 minutes just on that topic like we did this morning? If I was going to try to identify it very quickly, our true self is that which is connected to and emanates the infinite creator Jesus called Father. That's our true self. It's not independent, it's not disconnected, nor ever can be. However, if you remember, we talked this morning about what makes love love, and the image and likeness of that love, aka God, right? God is love, is choice. You can't be forced to love. You can't be manipulated to love. You can't be coerced to love. You even can't be commanded to love, which is the irony of John 15 when Jesus says, "This is my commandment." When he actually says that, read the rest of it, he's actually saying, I can't command you to do this. But point is, that true self requires choice. Love is a choice. To love you, for you to love somebody is a choice. You can't be forced. If you are forced and you do that, you're now just an obedient slave. And Jesus says, I do not call you slaves or servants, but I call you friends. John 15, same chapter. So he's upsetting the apple cart a little bit here. So with that, then comes the false self. The false is the choice when we choose away from love. The only other choice is selfishness or the ego, personified in the book of Genesis, 3rd chapter, as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's now our egos wanting to be right, not be wrong, wanting to be good, not be evil, all those things. That is now an egoistic life. That is a false, fabricated self, because that's not our true self. It's something we have taken on and clothed ourselves with. And what salvation, the gospel, we use whatever other terms, conversion that we use in Christendom, is really the unveiling of our true self by the removing of the false self. Hence, Jesus says, if you just take up your cross and follow me, who's getting crucified there? The egoism, the self-centeredness. And that's how we follow him, because that's how he lives. He's not asking us to do anything he hasn't already done or doesn't live from. Does that answer the question a little?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. You refer to the ego a lot in everything you write, to be honest. And is the ego essentially what some people would call Satan?
Yes.
So are we saying, maybe it's a bigger question for later, but Satan being a being, or is it a choice that we make as part for our ego.
Keep going. It's all good. Consider this. The word Hasatan comes from the Hebrew. We readapt it into the New Testament as again, Satan. But Hasatan, also known as the Sitra Achra in Hebrew, is what's called the evil inclination. Our Jewish brothers and sisters who are pretty orthodox do not believe in a personal Satan like most of us Christians do. Okay, their concept of the Satan, it's always said with the article in front of it, usually Ha-Satan, the Satan, as opposed to Satan as a person's name. Same applies to Adam in the book of Genesis. It's Ha-Adam, the Adam. Why? Because Adam is a function, not a person. It's not his name. Okay. Matter of fact, that's a whole nother story, but both are called Adam in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. There's no Adam and Eve in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, if you notice. There's just Ha-Adam. Eve doesn't get her name until after the fall. And the word Eva, which comes from the Septuagint, doesn't appear till the chapter 4 of Genesis. Point is these names, these ideas are usually quite different. What we have done as these ideas moved into the Western world, most of the deities in the Western world, Zeus, Jupiter, go down the list of all our Western gods that we can come up with, are, when I use the term today, objective experience. They're outside. Zeus is on Olympus. Satan is over there. The demon is in that corner. All those kinds of things. It's objective experience. But if I go back to my Hebrew roots, and if I go back to the teaching of Jesus, it's not objective experience. It's inner awareness. Hence, the kingdom is within us. Back to that. Okay? Kingdom's not out there. Kingdom's in here. Right? See here, see there. That's not where it is, Jesus says. Why? It's not objective experience. It's our inner awareness of something far greater. So Satan is no different. Think of there's an interesting verse, how we misread this verse because of a preconceived idea maybe of theology. So Jesus says to his disciples, day's going to come where they're going to lift the Son of Man up. And it explains that he's talking about his death at that point. And all of a sudden, Peter jumps up and says, it shall not be so. No, it's not going to happen. And Jesus replies with an interesting statement. He says, get behind me, Peter, for you don't speak the things of God, but the things of Satan. Well, that's how we read it, but that's not what it says. Rather, he says, get behind me, Satan. You don't speak the things of God, but the things of man. So who is Satan directly connected to now? Man. Egoistic, short-sighted man. And he's pointing to Peter. Actually, literally, if the way the Greek words is actually Jesus turned his back. He said, get behind me. We say get behind me. Actually, the text is a verb. He's turned his back to Peter and said, you're behind me, Satan, speaking to Peter. You don't speak the things of God, but the things of man. So the things that man speaks, the egoistic man that has not become God aware, or the creator, the Father aware, whatever words you want to use for the moment, he speaks the Satan, because the Satan operates out of good, evil, right, wrong, serpent in the tree, all those things. And that's exactly what Peter did. So I don't know if that answered your question totally. But it's bigger than that. It's not just my ego that's the Satan. Yes, it is. Because Hasatan just means adversary. That's all it means. That which is adverse to the nature of God, which would be love. So if I'm selfish, that's Satan. It's so simple. We used to have a lady in our church say it's so simple, it's almost stupid. There's a truth to that. At the same time, there's a broader power or dynamic that's there too. On the positive, Matthew 18. If two or more are gathered together in my Hashem, my name, which in Hebrew is my essence, not a label. Okay? So when you say Yeshua, that's an imperfect tense verb, by the way. That's not a noun, Yeshua. But we use it as a noun for a name. We say Jesus, but Yeshua literally means delivering. It's the action of delivering, the action of freeing, the action of liberating. So when two or more are gathered in my essence, there I am, the liberator in the midst. Well, the same applies on the negative side. You get three egos in a room. That's extremely self-centered, but agrees on, let's say, a certain point. What manifests with that? A larger ego. Call it Satan, if you wish. Hope that helps.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Coming back towards the book, chapter 4 is the Great Barrier.
Ah, yes.
And the barrier is something that we refer to in lots of different phrases with glass ceilings and looking glasses and windows and all sorts of metaphors you use in trains rushing through the barrier. Do you just want to explain what you mean by the barrier?
Okay, so I in the book, first of all, this particular book is written on the back of two other books I've written. As you know, I've written quite a few, but two others I've written called Melchizedek, Our Gracious King, Priesthood in Christ, Volume 1. And then I came out with, last year, Volume 2, which is called Tree of Life Realities, Melchizedek, Volume 2. And both those books have 1,144 pages together with over 130 footnotes to deal with the language, the theology, etc. So if you're the kind of person that has the question, but doesn't the Bible say this verse? Chances are you want to go to one of the Melchizedek books, read the 1,144 pages that's going to deal with all kinds of things that come around what I'm calling the doctrine of Melchizedek. Melchizedek, for example, doesn't deal with blood sacrifice. Never was in the equation. Like, for example, if you go through the book of Genesis, from Genesis to its completion, never once has Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Joseph ever asked for a sin sacrifice. Never. Why? Wasn't relevant. Melchizedek doesn't think on those terms. Grace, acceptance, love, etc. doesn't think on those terms. It wasn't until the degeneration starts into that Suzerain covenant where sin becomes an issue. That said, the barrier that I talk about in the book comes from two angles, because this book then is taking those 1,144 pages, pushing out 90% of all the scriptures, all the references, the Hebrew, Greek. I use very little on the language. And even when I quote a verse in this book, which is not too often, I don't even tell you the address. I don't even tell you where it is. You figure it out. You know, the book is meant to speak the concepts of the gospel and the nature of God, or the nature of the Creator, the Father of us all, if you will, as a they. I definitely use a perichoresis Trinitarian idea, but at the same time, even the Trinity concept is flawed in the sense that this is an ever-expanding perichoresis because you're a part of it. So with that said, the barrier basically is address it this way, because when we came up with the notion of a God, I talk about, for example, how one of the aspects of a God was if a volcano erupted way back when, one of the gods must have gotten angry. So now there's lava coming down the side of the mountain where we live. Somebody must have done something really wrong to anger that God. They had no concept of this liquid rock underneath the earth because it's really hot that gets under pressure over time and builds up and blows. And to them, it was a god. Same thing happens if frost comes before harvest. I talk about the frost god. When that comes, To them, the frost god was angry, and now we either need to do a sacrifice or something to make the frost god happy. Knew nothing about weather changes and how weather works. So, as we start to move forward now, we have these two, I call wagons in the book. We're going to have the wagon of science and the wagon of God, or religion. And the barrier we wind up hitting begins with usually the question, okay, so you say I'm supposed to believe in God. Fine. And I'm just supposed to accept that God exists. Meh, maybe. Where did God come from? And at that point, if you're on the God wagon, you can hear a wheel start to squeak a little bit. Well, where did God come from? I don't know. He always was. Yeah, but you're saying he created everything. Who created God? Now the wheel is wobbling even bigger. And before you know it, the wheel comes off and you're stuck with, I don't know. I've hit a barrier. On the science side, very similar. How did we come into existence? Well, there was a big bang. And all the planets and stars were flung out into existence as a result of that. Okay, great. Where did the Big Bang come from? Well, there was a singularity that was very hot and dense, and as a result of the heat and density of the singularity, the Big Bang occurred. Okay, great. Where did the singularity come from? Now you can hear the same squeaky wheel on the other wagon come off and was dragging on the ground. Now, the thing I respect about science here, more so than us religious folks, is when new information comes to a scientist, they course correct. When the hypothesis, and they're willing to say, this is a hypothesis. The singularity is a hypothesis. That's a big fancy word to say, we really don't know, but we think it's this. And we're going to put out that thought so it can be tested to see if it's proven. If it's proven, it becomes a theory. We're good. Not religious folks. We don't want hypothesis. We want to be certain, even if we don't know what the blankety blanket is. We want to be certain that that's the truth, and I got the truth, and you don't got the truth, and we're right back to the serpent doing his thing. The barrier, ultimately, is our egoistic self that can't see past a bang or where God came from. And then I start going through the book, but there has been a proven, my view, don't have to agree, way to break those barriers. And it's been practiced by certain mystics and leaders. Jesus, I put at the top of the list as the one who's come to show us that. And what breaks the barrier, I was just talking to a brother here, I'm not going to point him out because I don't want to make him feel funny, how he said to me, it sounds crazy, but I can actually sense eternity flowing through and in me. I said, you've broken the barrier. Because all the physical signs and all the religious reasons, whether it's science or religious, can't pass the egoistic barrier. But the second we're willing to start to lay that down and turn away from that, all of a sudden our true self immediately comes forward. And now all of a sudden we're way beyond a barrier. I hope that helped.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. I'm just going to read a bit from the start of chapter 4, if that's okay.
Go for it.
So you say, as we get close to the barrier, we begin to hear thoughts. People saying, there's nothing beyond here. There's only me. I'm my own person. You can't tell me how to think. You better prove to me that what you say is true. If you can't, it only proves you know very little. Stop now. Admit you have no evidence. There's only theories about what's beyond this point. Turn around and you can go home with the gratification of at least knowing that you're honest with yourself. But then from another pattern of thought we hear, you're not worthy enough. You're a flawed individual. Only the true holy ones can enter. Sinner, stop now, bow before me, worship me. Just believe and everything will be fine. I'll bless you with a safe journey home and the gratification of knowing that you're an honest person of faith. That really spoke to me. I guess where I'm leading with this is, would you say that often religion and institutions almost want to prevent people from reaching the barrier and breaking it?
Well, yeah, I think that is true, but I think there's a double-edged sword to that. The reason why folks want to prevent it is because they themselves haven't passed it. So, in other words, they don't know what to talk about either. So basically, what those, for lack of better terms, religion and institutions are just a bunch of people that have agreed that we don't know what's beyond there, but because we don't agree what's beyond there, therefore we're all good and we're right and we know exactly what we're talking about. But the fact is there are those that have pierced the barrier. Jesus being one of them. And in that case, Jesus is a good example of one who's pierced the barrier from both directions. He pierced it coming this way, incarnation, and then reveals it as pierced for us to perceive. He gives us an indication of how to perceive beyond it. It will get him killed. It's not going to be the wrath of the Father that's going to put him on the cross. God is not arguing with himself. You mentioned earlier in that segment about, bow before me, worship, and all this stuff. This is very narcissistic. And I go through a list of what narcissism is and then bring out pictures of both evangelical and pagan gods that behave this way, which gives way to a whole lot of other behaviors. Brother and sister here, I don't remember their names that were leading worship. We were talking earlier about some of the stuff we see happening in the U.S. right now with our politics, etc. Well, if you believe in an angry God, it's going to let you have angry leaders in the name of God who can be against the other guy, which is so serpentine, it's far be it from the Christ.
Thank you. Just want to draw conversation back to the idea of us being made in God's image and made to be like him. Because I always say Genesis 1:27 is my favorite verse because it says it twice, because we were made in God's image. In the image of God, he created us. And I remember being at, I won't mention the name of it, but a very well-known Christian conference, and there's a very well-known speaker there who, again, I won't say, and he did this huge talk, and it was how he'd watched the space shuttle take off, and how he was so in awe of the power of this space shuttle taking off, even though he was so far away from it. And he was linking back to God and likening that experience to us being so in awe of God. And the phrase was, if God is I am, then that makes us I am not. And that was the whole talk about, if God is I am, then that makes me I am not. And that stuck with me for many years. Obviously, that's the complete opposite of where you're approaching things from.
Me and centuries and centuries and thousands of years of other mystics, rabbis, etc., would all be contrary to that. When Rabbi David Aaron, for example, talks about Achye, Asher, Achye, which is I am that I am in Hebrew, okay, and he talks about that there is only the one great I am, of which I can't even go outside and say, I'm paraphrasing right now a little bit because I don't remember exactly how he worded it, but I can't go outside and say, I am going to get some milk without invoking I am. It's I am that connected. I am and I am is that. When Jesus says, I and the Father are one, he's saying, I am that. And the whole point of really saying that, where he ends, we talked this morning to John 17, is you are that. And we perpetually have the choice, it's called love, it's a choice to either shed and recalibrate our ego and walk in what love looks like, or we can continue in the illusion of an egoistic world and an egoistic self separated from God. If Jesus is an example of us, Jesus is the one who said, before Abraham was, I am. So are you.
Beautiful. I'm just going to read. I don't even know what chapter this is. But later on, I think this is in the final chapter. Actually, say, Let go of what you thought a God was and know that there's something greater. Better said, there's someone greater. No, even better than that. Know that there's an infinite intelligence, a universal consciousness sourced in a symphony of love that's eternal, and that you are an expression of them. I think that summarizes this wonderfully. We've got just a few minutes left. I think it would be good just to talk about the analogy you use of the mirror and the looking glass.
Okay.
If you could do that in 5 minutes or so.
5 minutes or so. Watch the clock. Because those analogies of the mirror on the wall, the glass ceiling, comes from climbing the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so I'm going to have to bypass of what it means to climb the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and basically say that we as egoistic creatures love the high-hanging fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we'll climb over anybody or anything to get there, because we know that if we attain that, we'll be more secure. However we attain that. That's a chapter in itself, so that's gone now. So, but when we get to the top there is the barrier again, the ceiling, if you will, a glass ceiling. And the way the principle works is the stronger the ego, the denser the glass. Think of it that way. The stronger the ego, the denser the glass, which means the more of my egoistic self I see, then beyond the barrier where my true self and oneness with the Father is. So as the idea of the glass ceiling then is that I get to the top of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I now have all these rights and wrongs won, and I now believe, all these different things now that got me here. And I look up, and I'm now seeing a reflection of somebody looking down. Well, it's still me, remember, right? Get behind me, Satan. You don't speak the things of God, but of man. Okay, so it's my reflection, but because I'm looking up, it's a God. And go down the list of different gods that they are. Now, once in a while, when my ego is pretty exhausted of being right, I may see just past the glass a little bit and see something there that actually resembles the true. But the problem now is I have a hybrid. I have a God who is true, love, joy, patience, all those positive, life, light. But then my reflection's mixed in it. Judgment, arrogance, condemnation, eternal damnation, all those things are all mixed in. So that's our glass ceiling first. Then in the next chapter, it becomes, to use another metaphor, the mirror on the wall. We are totally good with mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And the voice comes back with the same smile that's on our face, because we know who that is, right? You are, of course. Right? And we walk away going, yeah, it's me. I knew that. But that's coming from that dense egoistic self still. And finally, in a sense, jumping ahead of several paragraphs here, we walk up to that same mirror and we go, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And then the mirror says, Snow White. What? I'm not the number one son? Really? Actually, he doesn't say Snow White, but that's how it happens in the Grimm's fairy tale. But we know what Queen Grimhilda does at that point, right? She sends a hunter out to kill Snow White because we can't have anything else around here but me, says the ego. The only gods we want are gods that resemble us, right? But it's like going up to the mirror and saying, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And he says, well, there's this God of love. And he doesn't require sacrifices to pay him off for his anger against your sin. He just forgives. The response? What's this false teaching I hear that's now in our midst? My gosh, no way. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the God that has such gall? Well, the mirror says, you can try to kill it, but it keeps coming back to life. You can't kill this. The finite can't kill the infinite. It just can't happen. It'll just keep coming back and coming back and coming back. And it still does. The Christ keeps coming back, keeps coming back. Every time we even try to kill it in our own lives through our own selfishness, it'll come back. So I don't know if that's totally answered your questions about the mirrors, but the mirrors were a way that come from our the metaphor and our mythologies like Grimm's fairy tales, etc., that were used to tell these stories. And I use them in the book to reiterate that idea about the density of ego defines the greater reflection of ourself, even though we may call that God.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll leave it there. We're moving on to our Q&A in 10 minutes or so. I hate it when somebody does a big speech like this and goes, and now, if you'd like to come and buy my book, it's $10.99 out the back. So we're not selling any of your books, but if you'd like,
there are none here.
There are none here. You literally can't buy one. But well, not here. But the internet is a wonderful thing, and if what you've read does really interest you and you want to explore it, I'll post some links as well. There's a similar discussion that John has done with Karen, his wife, and also pastor of the church, when they discuss things which extends even further, which you might want to watch. And the book is on Amazon in Kindle or as a hard copy. So you could go home and start reading it tonight on your Kindle device if you'd like to. Just search for it on there. We don't even know how much it is, do you?
Oh, well, the publisher actually sets the price, but the Kindle book is like $9. It's not big money. And I'm not sure the paperback, I think it's just a couple of dollars more. Unlike the Melchizedek books, were like 2 bricks that if you don't like them, you can use them as boat anchors. They're so thick. This one is a lot more thinned out because all this other stuff is missing that I did in the other books that you can just read and enjoy. But so hopefully it'll be a blessing to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, John. We'll take a 10-minute break then. Yeah. Thank you.